Hello, everyone. We are in week 5 of EDU 503. I just returned from an online faculty meeting with St. Thomas, so if you'll give me just 1 second, I'll open up the PowerPoint presentation for this week, and we'll get started. I don't anticipate a lot of people showing up this week because it is a resubmission week, but again, I want to make sure I go over the highlights for this assignment this week. Hello. And I did get a late start. Again, I apologize for that because our faculty meeting that is on Wednesday nights did run over as well. So I want to make sure I give you guys the time that you need. Interestingly enough, the main topic for our paper, for our faculty meeting this week was plagiarism and the absolute subversion that we're experiencing as professional educators when our students are tremendously having problems with plagiarism and APA format. And the question was posed, what do we do about it? What is the solution to the problem? And obviously, as you guys already know, I have a system in place for preventing plagiarism. And I think one of the most important things that we can do as your instructors is give you a visual of what the problem is in your paper and what is too similar and where the mistake is, give that to you in feedback and give you the opportunity to correct that mistake. Now, granted, when we have papers that are 75% borrowed, that poses a problem. However, I think in my course, the majority of students are well on their way to understanding APA format and the entire process by the end of the term. Usually by the time the second draft of the research problem is submitted, the APA thing clicks. And I think templates help, I think exemplars help, but I think specific feedback is the most help of all. So, we are battling some of the same issues as educators, and if you're already in the field of education, you probably experienced some academic integrity issues as well. That just comes with the territory. Okay, so return on investment, just so that you know, as part of the system in Canvas, I have access to how often you log on, how much time you spend online, how much time you spend participating, how many times you've participated in each segment, when was the last time you were actively involved. And all of this data goes to show me as an instructor what you're doing when you're online, and is there something I need to do to help you improve your time online. So please be aware that you are going to get a return on the investment. And if you spend 10, 12 hours over the course of 7 weeks, you're probably not going to get the return that someone is getting for spending 24 or 25 hours. And I'm not talking about staying logged into Canvas and watching that total activity time just click over to the next minute and the next minute and the next minute. I'm talking about time participating. Just be aware that that's an important component. It is an online course, and a lot of what we do is independently paced. However, the interaction between you and the other students and you and me is very important for the growth process. The discussion board initial posts are due on Wednesday, the written assignments are due on Saturday, and the discussion board replies are due on Sunday. Now, this week, your second submission is due for your research problem. And I just wanted to scroll through some of these slides that you've probably already seen. Usually we like for you to write proposals that focus on descriptive or inferential measures, statistics. However, in reality, descriptive statistics include organizing the information and setting up categories. So that's a natural part of any study. Inferential comes into play with what you do with those results. And usually inferential is quantitative, but depending on how your qualitative study goes, you may also have inferential statistics there as well. So you just can't plain old label, my study is descriptive, my study is inferential, because it's going to be a lot deeper than that in the end. However, I think the intention of the course is to determine, are you going to be focusing on just the population that you're studying, or are you going to take those results and apply what you have learned or what you have found to another greater, larger, or different population? If you're going to do that, then all in all, you're generalizing to a larger population. Your study will use inferential statistics. If you're sticking with the same small group or same study, and you're organizing that information and summarizing trends within that study, then primarily your study is descriptive. So I just reviewed that information. So for example, the research problem is where you have done your literature review and you have arrived at a gap in the studies, a gap in the literature, a question that has not been answered. And an example of that might be many students in America are several grade levels behind in reading. The research question poses a question that may very well help solve that problem. How does leveling for reading instruction impact students' reading ability? So if I wanted to move on and hypothesize and become very, very specific, a hypothesis goes with a quantitative study only, where you're going to measure statistically and mathematically the results of achievement or other mathematical measures. There's a relationship between leveled reading and instruction, leveled reading instruction and student reading ability. Now, if we set this up as a correlational study, we might say the more time we spend instructing students at the levels where they are, leveled reading, where you have all the same level of student in one group, the higher each student's reading ability goes. That would be a correlational study. But if you have just the general question, does leveled reading instruction impact student reading ability? And if you turn that into a hypothesis and said leveled reading instruction increases students' reading ability, then you would be looking for the difference. So there's a nuance there. You have to determine whether or not you're looking for a relationship between or a difference in. So then your research question is the question that the study is going to answer, and your hypothesis is the prediction about the results of the test. Now, be very careful here, because if you have a qualitative study, meaning that you have a research question, you're focusing on the perceptions of the participants or human interaction, you are focusing on the quality as far as how do the students feel, how do the teachers feel, what is the experience of the parents, you're going to work with a qualitative analysis. But with a hypothesis, you are testing your prediction of what the data is going to say, what outcome. So there will be, when you hypothesize, you're either going to say there will be a difference between variables. So there will be a difference between students' reading ability and students' reading ability after we've done leveled reading. So you have your independent and dependent. Your independent is going to be the thing that won't change. There will be a relationship among variables. That is when you're doing something like a correlational study. So one of the things that I noticed in the research problems this week is we did not speak to the alternative hypothesis, and that can be very confusing. If you want to test a research question, you develop the research hypothesis, you develop the null and the alternative hypothesis. So the null hypothesis is not the opposite of the research hypothesis. The null hypothesis simply states they're not true based on the information we have. It could be by chance or it could be another reason, but leveling does not result in, we cannot prove through this study that leveling results in students' increased reading ability. Okay? So the alternative hypothesis, I'm hoping that you're not having problems with my speakers. The alternative hypothesis basically is restating the original research hypothesis. So really what you're doing is you're proving the null not to be true if the alternative hypothesis is true. And it's the same thing as the research hypothesis, but you have to say the alternative hypothesis is true, same as the original prediction, leveling for reading instruction increases students' reading ability. Now, like I said before, the null is not saying the opposite, that it decreases students' reading ability. It's just saying that we don't see an increase caused by leveled reading instruction. So I talked already a little bit about the difference in independent and dependent variables and the purpose that they serve. And then I referenced in the PowerPoint presentation, nominal measurement is just labeling information. You're categorizing information, and there's really no measure involved. You're just trying to distinguish between groups. Correlational studies focus on relationships among variables. When we do this with variable A, when we increase leveled reading, we will increase reading ability. So a positive correlation would be an increase and an increase. A negative correlation would mean an increase in leveled reading and a decrease in students' reading ability. So it's different than what you would have when you're talking about independent and dependent variables. So this chart describes nominal, ordinal, and interval measurement. You can read that on your own. You can walk yourself through it, but the pieces of measurement need to be added to the research problems this week. Most everyone will have nominal measurement. Everybody with a quantitative study will have ordinal or interval, depending on what direction your qualitative study takes. You may simply have observations and you will not be ranking students or performance or behaviors, but usually you have at least nominal and qualitative. And so on this types of scales and properties, these are examples of tools that you actually use and terms that you reference to do those sorts of tests. This is also important, and it helps me to see things in a chart or a graph form, because you take away all of the words that don't matter and you simply see what does matter. So I am not going to click on this link, but it is an excellent tutorial on the difference between qualitative and quantitative studies. I think one of the weaknesses we have in this course is that we don't take the time before we talk about inferential and descriptive statistics. We don't spend enough time talking about qualitative studies versus quantitative studies, and they're very, very different. And so take a moment to look at this video so that you know that you're on the right track, because in your proposal, I will expect you to tell me, I am doing a qualitative study because it fits my study because, and vice versa for quantitative. Okay, so for draft number 2, it's basically the same thing as draft number 1, but with more detail and corrections added. Now, I will say this. If I were designing this course, I would not have draft 1 and draft 2 of assignment 2. I would simply have assignment 2 due, and I would work somewhere else to help you guys with APA format early on to get you ready for the other parts of the course. However, because it's there and because I'm required to follow the curriculum, you will be resubmitting the same assignment with some polishing, responding to feedback, and hopefully adding the component about qualitative or quantitative research and also your measures. All right, week 4, assignment. This rubric is basically the components and the criteria from the assignment page pasted in. It was reiterated to us tonight at our faculty meeting that we must count off for APA errors and grammar errors, which I naturally do anyway. So it's nice to know that we're all on the same sheet of music with that, and it is required. With the discussion board prompt, you're talking about your variables coming up, where you discuss descriptive or inferential. You should say something about qualitative or quantitative, and then you need to talk about what your variables are in the study. They'll either be independent or correlational. And if you have a qualitative study, you won't have variables. You will have a population and an open research question, and your results from those questions, as far as the surveys, the interviews, the observations, you have to have triangulated data there, 3 different methods of collecting information. That will lead you to your final outcome. So it does look different for qualitative and quantitative. The discussion board rubric is on the syllabus. It is not in SpeedGrader at this time. So I wanted to make sure you were aware of the point values. Please note that the original post is 2.5 points and the reply is 2.5 points. But be aware that we are probably down to 4 people in this class. We started with 9. So it's really hard for you to reply to 2 other students. So 1 reply works just fine. Don't worry. It's the nature of the process for the classes to reduce to about 50%, just because it's the first graduate course. People don't realize that it was such a time commitment. Things happen in life and they drop, and then they take the class again next term, or they decide that graduate school is not for them. So that's a natural part of the process in graduate school. Just a note to yourself, you are not required to actually conduct the study and complete the statistical analysis. So don't be afraid of the type of analysis that would be required if you're doing a quantitative study. You're simply setting up and proposing the study. You are required to write a lucid research proposal and articulate which types of statistical measures and analyses would be appropriate for your study. So you are required to go in there and behave as if you're conducting the study. I just don't want you to be worried about how am I going to do all of this analysis, because most of us, we end up hiring somebody to do the analysis, simply because for most people the math is daunting. So just be aware of those things. I'm going to stop the share and open up to any questions that you may have. I see we have 2 people on board, and make sure you click unmute if you have a question.
Dr. Sands,
yes.
I have a question.
Okay.
So one thing that's kind of been on my mind now for a while, and I should have brought it up sooner, in reading about both experimental and correlational research design as per our textbook and all the other reading material that you have provided us, I'm wondering if those 2 types of research design can come together and overlap much in the same way that some research projects, some studies have both qualitative and quantitative. Do those also merge a lot of times, or
they shouldn't, for the same reason why I discouraged a mixed methods study for the purpose of this class, because literally you have to set up 2 very diverse, complete studies to have credibility on both sides. You can't just have a little bit of quantitative, a little bit of qualitative, a little bit of experimental, a little bit of correlational. You have to make a decision, because the hypotheses will contradict one another. For example, with the reading example I gave. So in a traditional experimental design, I would say that leveled reading instruction improves students' reading ability. Okay, so that's my independent. But in correlational, we're saying how much. We're saying when we increase leveled reading instruction, we also increase students' reading ability. So we're assuming by setting up a correlational study that there is an impact. You see what I'm saying? We don't know for sure in the experimental if there's an impact. We're determining if there's an impact. So as an original study, we might do the experimental, and when we find out, oh yes, there's an impact, then we go to correlational for our next study and say how much of an impact. Is there a point of diminishing return with that? And does that work for every level of student, or just struggling students? Does it work with gifted students? And so you really want to keep it basic, because every study is the birth of many new future studies. So you're just doing something very basic to answer a simple question, and then depending on the outcome of your study, you will lead other people, maybe even yourself, into even further research after that to go beyond. And that's how we develop educational theories. It starts small, and then we go, oh, well, let's look at it this way. Oh, well, let's look at it this way and this way. And then what about the perspective of the participants? Qualitative. And it blossoms into educational theory at some point. So I think the hard part is loving your topic and trying to decide what you want to know more. And so sometimes you just have to back up and separate your passion from the topic and say, okay, how can I best create true, credible results to solve this problem? and that's where you focus first.
Got it. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Sands.
Okay.
It's a very complete and the answer I was looking for, actually, because I was on the fence about the two things, and I'll be going back to amend my discussion board post for this week because I kind of blended the two. I'm going to go with experimental.
Yeah. I you know, like I said, when you're very passionate about what you do, especially, I know that you have many sources already involved in your process. You're being pulled in so many different directions that you've got to focus on one valuable piece of information, and that's not the be all and end all. It's just the beginning of your research. This one proposal for this one study is going to just be the beginning. And if you look at it that way, you can be satisfied. I personally prefer qualitative studies because I think the human interaction is a huge component in the field of education that we ignore. And I think the qualitative side impacts the quantitative. So I go qualitative first, and then I follow up with quantitative, and then correlational after that. That's kind of the direction that I go. Once I see that there's a difference, how much of a difference? And so, but I tend to start with the human component first, because I think sometimes we believe we're doing something, but we're really not. And we don't take the perception factor into consideration. So
that's awesome.
I think you're on the right track.
Thank you, Dr. Sands. And
right.
I like your explanation there about the path that you follow, qualitative to quantitative. I only really chose quantitative. I prefer qualitative, but I went with quantitative because all the literature was mostly qualitative. So I saw that that's where we're lacking for my specific topic. But it makes a lot of sense. I appreciate your explanation.
Okay, no problem at all. Any other questions? Okay, well, that seems to be pretty quick. Please email me if you have questions this week. We are in week 5, only 2 weeks left. The next step is the design of the study, which is, to me, I think the literature review was very hard, and I think the research problem is a little less hard, and I think the design of the study is even easier if you have followed the steps so far, especially taking into consideration the discussion we just had. So, and then in week 7, we put it all together. We make a few pretty accommodations as far as making it all blend into one cohesive APA formatted research proposal, and then we're done. So please don't hesitate to contact me if you need help, have specific questions. But thank you so much for hanging in there. We are more than halfway through your first course. So thanks so much and take care.